Good afternoon, everyone. Seeing that I have a start time of noon here and we have a packed agenda, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off here. So good afternoon and thanks for being here. My name is Heather Wendell and I'm a senior director at Afton Partners. Prior to that, I served in various roles within Chicago Public Schools for over 20 years. And today I am so pleased to welcome you on behalf of CPS Superintendent Dr. Macklin King and her team to the first of two virtual learning sessions that are part of Dr. King's commitment to public engagement related to the FY26 budget. To note, this session is part of a series that will also include 5 public feedback sessions. More on this work in the series will be presented later in the session. I want to take us quickly through the agenda so that we understand the structure of today's session. Following introductions and context setting, we'll have a panel discussion followed by Q&A and then a brief closeout. Participants can enter questions for the panelists Q&A by using the Q&A function in the Zoom. And now I'm pleased to introduce our panel for today. Dr. Fatima Cook serves as Chicago Public Schools Chief of Equity and Engagement. Prior to this position, Dr. Cook served as the Deputy Chief of Schools for Network 5. She has served 5 years as principal and 2 years as assistant principal in Sumner Math and Science Community Academy in Chicago's North Lawndale community. We're also joined today by Ralph Martiri. Ralph serves as the Executive Director for the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. The CTPA, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization committed to advancing social and economic justice for all. During his time at CTBA, Ralph has helped obtain numerous legislative successes, including the passage of the evidence-based model of education funding in 2018. Next, Professor Elizabeth Todd Breland. Elizabeth Todd Breland focuses on 20th century United States urban and social history, African American history, and the history of education in her research and teaching. Her work also explores interdisciplinary issues related to racial and economic inequality, public policy, neighborhood transformation, education, policy, civic engagement. And from 2019 to 2024, she served as a member of the Chicago Board of Education, including serving as vice president of the board. Moving on through our last introduction of a panelist today, we have Kevin Wenzel, who's a senior director with Afton Partners, a nationally recognized education consulting firm active in early childhood, K-12, and workforce development. Kevin leads state level and district level projects across the country with focuses on more transparent and equitable resource allocation and funding policies. A welcome to all of our panelists here today. Now I'm going to turn things over to CPS Chief Budget Officer Mike Sikowski, who's going to walk us through some context setting for today's discussion. Mike?
Thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. My name is Mike Sikowski. I'm the Chief Budget Officer for Chicago Public Schools. And I want to set some context around why we're here and talk a little bit about some of what CPS's current budget looks like and some of the challenges that we're facing moving forward. First, we're here because we are dealing with a deficit of $734 million ahead of the passage of the FY 2026 budget. And what that means is between now and us approving our budget for next year, we will have to solve through either additional funding or reduced expenditures for $734 million total. We're facing significant funding challenges ahead of next school year and into the future, and finding these solutions to these challenges is going to require a collective effort. The goal of today's learning session is to hear from local and national experts about our budget history, about where things stand now, and about what solutions can be considered going forward. As Heather mentioned at the top, today's session is part of a series of public engagement sessions that we're doing around the FY 2026 budget. This initiative is led by Dr. King, and our goal is to ensure transparency into our current financial situation and gather feedback on priorities of our stakeholders. So we're launching this process to hear directly from you all about the tough budget decisions we have ahead. Last night, we kicked off our community feedback sessions. First was at Diet High School, and coming up later this week, we'll have 2 more sessions on Tuesday and Thursday, followed by a session Saturday, and lastly, by a virtual session on Monday, July 21st. In conjunction with these community feedback sessions that are designed to be able to collect feedback from community members, we're hosting these public learning sessions, including today's, that's going to focus on how we got here. We will also be hosting a second public learning session on how we move forward to discuss solutions for CPS looking forward. And these conversations will be broadcast live here today and available afterwards to watch on our YouTube channel. I mentioned our $734 million deficit for next year, and want to set some context on what is driving our deficit. Our challenges are due in part to long-standing resource constraints that limit the funding we have available to meet the needs of our schools and our students. First, our evidence-based funding, which is the primary avenue of state funding for K-12 education in Illinois, remains, for CPS alone, over $600 million short of reaching the state's goal of 90% funding levels for all districts by FY 2027. Second, federal pandemic aid has expired, and federal funding remains under threat, with $60 million of Title II, III, and IV funding at risk that supports teacher training and coaching, planning and curriculum development, staff recruitment efforts, supports for English learners and their parents, STEM, community schools, and other essential programming. Lastly, our ability to generate local revenue is limited under state law, which provides us minimal capacity to combat these state and federal funding challenges. Looking at our overall budget, we see that our two graphs here. One is our revenues and one is our expenses. If we look on the left at our revenues, I want to point out that over 57% of the funding that CPS receives is local funding, meaning that it's funding from Chicago taxpayers. If we look at the chart on the right, where our funding goes, we see that in the green and purple areas of the dollar bill chart, over 95 cents of every dollar goes to direct support for schools, whether that's money going directly to schools in budgets controlled by principals and local school councils, or money that is providing direct support to schools. That includes our custodians, our nurses, and a lot of our folks that are managed citywide but support our students on a daily basis. Just 5% of our budget goes towards administrative expenses that do not directly support schools. Coming back to our deficit, while we have talked about our funding challenges at the local, state, and federal levels, we're also facing significant cost pressures and obligations that we have to meet that have come without additional funding for CPS. We've talked about this in recent board meetings, and we've talked about this in our public feedback sessions. But what we have seen is significant cost pressure from 3 key areas that have contributed largely to our deficit on the expense side of the equation. This is rising needs of required services for students with disabilities. We've seen over $450 million worth of growth, primarily through added staff, that we have added since 2019 to ensure that we are providing the required services for students with disabilities. Over this same period of time, funding has remained static for these services. And the gap between our rising costs and the lack of revenue keeping up has contributed to our overall deficit. We've also experienced the rising cost of maintaining CPS buildings. We have buildings that are an average age of over 85 years and that require $14 billion worth of deferred maintenance and upgrades. The fact that CPS does not have a dedicated revenue source for capital investments that allows us to make necessary investments and upgrades to our buildings means that we are taking money out of our operating budget to fund our bonds that cover these necessary capital investments. This limitation has driven increased costs for our annual maintenance in these buildings require us to add over 200 engineers over recent years and spend more money on routine maintenance, emergency maintenance, and environmental issues. So we've seen about $100 million worth of growth in annual cost for maintaining our buildings for our 500 schools. Lastly, we've seen growth in our historic pension obligations. Since 2023, CPS has been required to add over $100 million more from our operating budget from unrestricted revenue sources to meet our teacher pension obligation, as that obligation has grown faster than the revenue sources that support it. And we are also facing pressure on our non-teacher pensions, including $175 million that contributes to our current deficit projection for next year of $734 million. So with these cost pressures, we have not seen increases in revenue to help support them, and is a big part of what's driving our deficit on the expense side. A few other things we want to hit on here is that debt remains a challenge. So we have over $9 billion of existing long-term debt that requires over $800 million of annual payments. Over $500 million of these annual payments are covered by unrestricted state and local revenues that could otherwise be spent in classrooms. We still remain below investment grade or junk rated, which costs the district more to borrow for routine capital investments. In addition to our long-term debt, we also rely on $1.2 billion in short-term debt through a revolving line of credit to make payroll, pay vendors, and meet other obligations before revenue arrives. This is due to a lack of available fund balance to support day-to-day cash requirements and the fact that CPS receives a majority of its revenues, primarily property taxes, late in the fiscal year. Last year, we required our short-term tax anticipation notes to cover half of our payrolls, and we ended the year with a negative 18 days of cash on hand. Lastly, looking forward, we see significant challenges out into the future. So I mentioned the $734 million deficit. Without structural changes, what we're looking at as soon as FY27 is deficits that near $1 billion. The actions that we take in this year's budget, if they are structural in nature, will help our future years. But one-time solutions that we find this year will not help us eat into some of these big figures that we're looking at out into the future. So where we are today, to balance last year's budget, we identified over $500 million in efficiencies and reductions to offset the loss of pandemic relief funding and combat some of our continued cost pressures. Most of these savings, however, were one-time measures, meaning that we've already addressed all of the low-hanging fruit. Balancing the budget this year will require significant new revenue or force the district to rely on spending cuts or other one-time actions. In addition, state and federal support to help CPS in the short term remains limited. The state budget passed at the end of May in line with expectations and no significant additional support for CPS, and certain areas of federal funds are at risk based on recent actions of the Trump administration. It's important to highlight some of the progress that we've seen as well in recent years as we think about what the path forward looks like. Our graduation rate has never been higher. Nearly 7 out of every 10 graduates are enrolling in college. More than half of CPS students are now earning college credit, an industry certification, or another college or career credential while still in high school. Our last 2 graduating classes have earned more than $2 billion in scholarships. Our academic data shows that our elementary students are increasing proficiency rates in reading by more than 10 percentage points in the last 2 years. This growth is most prominent among our Black and Latinx boys and actually puts us at a higher proficiency rate in literacy than we were before the pandemic. Lastly, just 38% of new teachers were educators of color in 2021. Last year, thanks to our strategies that helped expand our recruitment, that number had jumped to 60%. We want to also talk about our guiding values as we talk about the path forward. Our goal is to collectively develop an equitable, student-centered solution to our budgetary challenges that acknowledges both short and long-term financial challenges. Our students and schools have made significant progress in recent years, and our choices must center on students' needs so they can build on their gains. Our approach must be aligned to our district strategic plan, which works to disrupt cycles of inequity and close opportunity gaps that impact students. and solving these challenges must be a collective effort, so your input will be critical to our path forward. So what comes next? This week, we'll be hosting our community feedback sessions and engaging in our public learning sessions. In late July, we'll be reviewing and analyzing the feedback from our communities to inform final decisions in the FY 2026 budget. In August, the budget will be finalized and presented to the board for approval at the August 28th board meeting. And long-term, we'll continue to work hard on solutions that combat our historic funding challenges. So with that, I want to thank everyone and turn it back over to Heather for our discussion.
Thank you so much, Mike, for providing us a bit of level setting context, which highlights both, two things that are clear in this space. CPS students have made incredible progress in recent years, and CPS's financial challenges are substantial and require a collective effort to solve, which is part of what brings us all to the table here today. And with that, I want to take some time now to hear from our panelists. Elizabeth, I'd like to start with you here. In the context of the overview that Mike provided, he touched on some of the resource constraints that have both proved challenging for the district over time. From your position as an education researcher and historian, what else is relevant to this part of the story?
Thanks, Heather. I appreciate the question. I think it's important to level set with this idea that education funding in Illinois has been inequitable in some ways since the founding of the state. And funding for CPS has also been inequitable for generations. The very act that established public education in Illinois explicitly stated that public schools be, quote, free and open to every class of white children, and that tax funds for education be based on the population of white children. So inequities were baked in various ways since the beginning, but have changed over time. So if we fast forward to the mid 20th century, in particular, as CPS students were becoming Blacker, browner, and more low income, these inequities were further exacerbated. By the mid 20th century, CPS was effectively operating a separate and unequal school system through things like Willis wagons and double shift schedules that compounded overcrowding, such that by that time, by the early 1960s, per pupil spending on Black children in Chicago was only 2/3 that which was spent on predominantly white schools. So when we look at civil rights era struggles in Chicago, they were responding to these inequities, and they were demanding a fully resourced, equitable education. And these are demands that remain elusive, unfortunately. So at the same time that that's happening in the middle of the 20th century, we have federal subsidies and state policies that are incentivizing white flight from city schools and undercutting the local tax base in that process, and supporting inequality and racial exclusion in suburbs. So whiter and wealthier communities engaged in opportunity hoarding to enrich their local schools. And they often did this using what we might understand as sort of seemingly colorblind tools, things like zoning, tax and regulatory policies, and other mechanisms of state government. For example, wealthier and white districts would refuse desegregation mandates or use zoning practices to maintain racial exclusion. And they fought, in fact, successfully against state funding equalization formulas. So we see greater inequity. So I say this to make the point that public policy at the state, federal, and local level have historically and continue to produce funding and educational inequities. And I want to run through a couple of these things quickly at those different levels of government. So at the federal level, the federal government historically was not a particularly big player in public education, but its role significantly increased beginning in the 1960s with new funding during the Great Society and civil rights era enforcement. So we see then the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which brings Title I funding for low-income students, later funding for students with disabilities, funding for English learners, the enforcement of civil rights laws and Title IX, and the Individuals with Disabilities Act, all happening at the federal level. And I want to note that all of these gains were forged in struggle. And the fact that they are being undone now by the Trump administration will further heighten inequality and harm CPS students. At the local level, more recently in Chicago, policies since 1995 that normalize the politics of austerity, that privatize public education, shifting public dollars into private hands, and treating education like a business really undermined the idea of public education as a public good and paved the way for some of the dismantling of public education. Just recently, yesterday, we saw the Supreme Court is going to greenlight the dismantling of the Department of Education that we're experiencing now nationally. So we think of these things as sort of extreme, perhaps right-wing initiatives, but this undermining of public education as a public good has been something that's been happening here locally for some time. To that point, CPS is still digging itself out of detrimental public policy decisions of this last 30 years. So the Daley and Vallis era of the pension holiday, in the 2010s with toxic financial tools that ballooned the district's debt at the same time that they were gutting special education. And so the position that we're in was manufactured. This is manufactured inequality. We are at the endpoint of generations of decisions. At the state level, I think often when we talk about public school governance, it's often thought of as supremely local, but it is in fact the state legislature that is ultimately constitutionally responsible for public schools in Illinois. And the Illinois state legislature has also actively facilitated education funding, taxation, and regulatory policies that have increased inequality and also treated Chicago public schools different than other districts. So the state of Illinois does not pay into funding CPS pensions, as was mentioned, like every other school district. Chicago is the only board in the state that is not allowed to, for example, pass referenda to raise their own capital funds. During as recently as the 2020-2021 school year, Illinois ranked in the bottom quarter, 39th out of 50 of all states in the country in the percentage of total public schools revenue provided by the state. And what this means is that it puts an undue reliance on local property taxes as the main mode of public education funding. And this is inherently inequitable. CPS continues to be woefully underfunded by the state's own metrics, which I know Ralph is going to talk about EBF in a moment. And CPS's ability to generate new revenue is truly capped. The schools cannot fix these problems alone, and the CPS actually does not have the capacity to print its own money or raise revenue in the same way that other places are. So the district then relies on local, state, and the federal government to meet students' needs. So I'll end just this moment by just saying the inequality that we experience in Chicago public schools, it is structural. It is the result of generations of inequitable public policy decisions at all levels of government. And thus, the solutions to this have to come from all levels of government, in addition to society more broadly. We all have a role to play in the community for supporting a fully resourced public school system, which requires new progressive sources of revenue, including things that compel corporations and the wealthy to pay their fair share. And I think we need to continue to push for this. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate that. And I think is a nice sort of encapsulation of all of the elements. And Ralph, I do want to turn to you next, as Elizabeth mentioned, to go deeper into the EBF piece. The passage of the state funding reform, EBF, evidence-based funding, was an enormous step forward for K-12 state funding in the district and for Illinois. And would like you, I know you were really involved in that work as we highlighted in the top of the session here. If you could talk a bit about that legislative journey and the shift to the EBF model and just what that has meant.
Yeah, thanks, Heather, and thanks for inviting me here. And I just want to point out that you were an incredible public servant in your time at CPS, and you were really accessible and transparent. And Mike Sitkowski is one of the greatest of all great Americans, and he's really available to help people out. You know, the public sector gets slammed a lot by the media and stuff, and I just want the world to know that the two of you took public service very, very seriously and did a phenomenal job. And Mike, you're still doing it. Now, as far as the EBF, the good news is it has substantially addressed the structural racism that was built into the state's approach to K-12 funding under its own foundation level. What the EBF is, the evidence-based formula, is pretty simple. It ties the dollar amount that taxpayers invest in the education of children into covering those evidence or research-based practices that have a statistically meaningful correlation to improving student achievement. So it really changes the approach to school funding from just let's pick a number out of the air, which is they did in the past, and that'll be our minimum foundation level per kid, not tied to any cost of educating children, and put in a standard that was evidence-based and tied to student achievement. The second thing it is it's an adequacy formula. So the model automatically adjusts the number of resources, dollar value of resources a school district will need to meet the educational requirements of the specific student population it serves. So it automatically adjusts based on low income count and English learner count, et cetera. And so two school districts could be right next to each other and have the exact same total enrollment of students, but one under the EBF would be needing significantly greater resources because it has a greater concentration of, let's say, low income special needs or English learner children than its neighboring district. I live in one of those, right? I live in River Forest, Illinois. And the school districts around us, Maywood, Bellwood, Austin, they get a lot more money per kid, and they should, and they need it, than we do under the formula. So that's how the formula was intended to work. And the better news is it works. So when the model was first implemented in fiscal year 2018, the typical funding gap faced by a Black or brown kid attending an underfunded school was around $2,000 more than the gap that a typical white kid faced that was in an underfunded school. That gap's been completely eliminated since the model's been in place. And now the gap it's still a gap, but the gap per student is the same irrespective of race or ethnicity. Illinois' never been there before. That's a radical new place for Illinois to be. That's the good news. The bad news is the model is underfunded. It's underfunded by about $2.7 billion statewide. And that underfunding translates to different districts in different ways. CPS is a unique school district, right? It's 68% low income. It's 82% minority. Most districts with that profile aren't sitting on boatloads of property wealth. City of Chicago has boatloads of property wealth, and property wealth matters in the calculation under the EBF formula. And so the EAV that's available to fund K-12 education in Chicago is much greater than it is in, let's say, other really poor primarily minority communities like in Pembroke or East St. Louis. You can look across the state. So Chicago is a very unique district in that one sense. And the second thing that has led to sort of a dink in CPS's funding over the years is it's had a pretty substantial decline in its low income population specifically and its overall enrollment generally. So overall enrollment for CPS is down by 15% since 2018 when the evidence-based funding formula was first passed into law. Low income enrollment is down by 26%. When you lose enrollment, and the EBF is an enrollment-based funding formula generally, and you lose low-income enrollment specifically, you're going to have a lower adequacy target of needs under the model, and hence you're going to seem better funded even without new money coming in. And that's been one of the things that's happened to CPS. The other thing that happened to CPS is couple of its revenue sources, and in particular, the corporate personal property replacement tax. It's going to make you smile, Mike. The CPPRT, which spiked, we saw a tremendous growth in revenue from that source. In fiscal year 22, it generated $193 million for CPS. By 24, that was up to almost 700 million. That's a monstrous spike. And that really helped close some of these funding gaps. Now, this is a tax that's based on corporate profitability. Well, corporations were price gouging during this period at record levels, and corporate profits were at highest levels historically they've ever been because they were taking advantage of the hyperinflationary period that followed the pandemic. They can't take advantage of that anymore. And that means this revenue source is going to decline. In fact, it's projected to decline by some 40% next year in fiscal year 2026. And on a year-to-year basis, that's going to cost CPS a couple of $100 million. So the bottom line is CPS has some unique characteristics about it. High EAV that it sits on, losing a major local revenue source. It's losing its ESSER dollars, right? Those are all gone, the federal supports. And that was over $2 billion, almost $3 billion, like 2.89 billion, something like that they received in ESSER funding, most of which went into plugging holes in the operating revenue. So that's gone. So that revenue source is going to need to be replaced going forward. So the state of Illinois, just to talk about some solutions going forward, the state of Illinois needs to do a better job of funding K-12 education generally. And if it does a better job of funding K-12, it will do a much better job of funding CPS. CPS, because of some of those unique characteristics, the spike in the CPPRT revenue, the deltas in its student populations, bumped itself up from a tier 1 school, which under the model gets the most funding, to tier 2. It is still tier 2, but barely by 1 percentage point. So in another year or two, CPS will in all likelihood fall back into tier 1 and see a tremendous increase in state funding. And I am going to talk about the pension issue. I think both Mike covered it very well in his presentation, and I really appreciate Elizabeth's comments about what the Daley and Vallis administrations did. The CPS the pension system, believe it or not, was 100% funded as recently as 2001. 100% funded. And then for a decade, the decision makers decided to zero fund it. You don't put any money into your pension system for a 10-year period, you're going to create a little bit of an unfunded liability that's going to be inherited by your taxpayers. So when the evidence-based funding formula passed, there was a major negotiation between CPS and the state over what should the state be doing to help CPS handle its pension obligations. At that time, 2018, the state was covering $0 of the pension contribution for CPS. CPS was on the hook for the whole thing. The negotiation went like this, and it's very rational. I think we're actually in a good place there, in a relatively fair place there today. The state said, you know what? We should be covering the normal cost contribution of your pension system. That is the benefit being earned by current members of your system, because the state covers that for every other school district in Illinois. Why shouldn't it cover that for CPS? And that's about $353 million last year. Mike, just correct me if I'm misremembering any numbers. It was about $353 million last year. That's $353 million CPS no longer has to raise and whatever. But the state said it's not going to do is cover your legacy debt, the unfunded liability. Because the reason you have legacy debt is you decided to zero fund your pensions. That didn't benefit anyone in the state other than people that lived in Chicago. It allowed you to take money that you should have put in your pension systems and plug it into your operating costs or your capital costs, whatever you plugged it into. And that helped CPS in Chicago. That didn't help anyone in Peoria or St. Louis, whatever. So we're not going to cover your unfunded liability, because really the only people that benefited from your creation of this problem, you were 100% funded, you created your own problem, is CPS or Chicago residents. They did, however, pass a new law that allowed, I'm going to try to get the number right, a new levy of 0.567%. Is that right? To cover the pensions? So with that, CPS last year got about $558 million. It owed over $600 million in change. So as Mike correctly pointed out, they had to divert over $100 million from operating revenue to cover the rest of this delta. But CPS is in a better position than it was prior to the EBF being passed, because the state stepped to the plate here. And I think going forward, the repayment of that debt, which is once again state law, this isn't a CPS required repayment period, is incredibly backloaded. And in fact, it's so backloaded that by the year 2059, that the debt payment alone is going to be close to $1.6 billion. It's at $600 million today. So think about that. It's going to go way up, and that's just irrational, unaffordable, and unattainable. So this has to be re-amortized and flattened out, and that's another way to help address CPS's finances going forward and take pressure off their current revenue.
Thank you, Ralph. And I think shining a light on some of the intricacies and complexities there, additional state funding, but not enough, the ESSER funds that you mentioned. I want to turn now to Dr. Cook. And within this, even though the district has continued in the space of not having all of the revenue it needs, there's been progress over how it allocates and spends its limited resources. And so, Dr. Cook, for you as an equity leader, a former school principal, how has this approach evolved and what impact has it had on the student experience in spite of some of these other challenges?
Thank you, Heather, for the question. Great to be in this space. When we think about the district's approach to allocating resources, we have evolved in meaningful ways, but we're also clear, as you said, that it's still not enough to meet every need. As a district, we've shifted to a more equitable funding model guided by tools like the CPS Opportunity Index, and it really helps us distribute dollars based on student and community need rather than this one-size-fit-all formula. But we're super clear-eyed that it doesn't mean that every school has all it needs, but what it does mean is that the funding and resources we do have, we're working to allocate them more equitably. Investments in students ultimately mean investments in people in schools. And as the dollar bill graphic that was showed early, 95% of that dollar goes directly to school-based expenditures and positions or citywide services and personnel that support our multiple schools in our system, whether that's counselors, bilingual educators, nurses, custodians. That deeply matters when leading a school or supporting school leaders, knowing how critical those roles are to the student experience. And then there's a lot of questions around CPS, the use of ESSER dollars, and I think in some cases, creating positions or funding operational costs with those limited one-time funds. But these investments that were super student-centered, at a time when students needed them the most, what we saw was that the infusion of those dollars really showed us what it looks like when we have a more fully funded system. And so I think from my perspective, parents, former principal, and now kind of in the district leader role, we think about those investments, whether it is system-wide investments in student voice, and investments in social emotional learning, behavioral health teams, all impactful to student experience. And these really aren't like abstract strategies. They show up in classrooms every day, helping students feel seen, supported, and ready to learn. And I think critically, we're also investing in adults who teach and care for students every day. We've grown the share of new teachers who are supporting our students who are educators of color, because we know that representation matters for students and their feeling, that they are welcome in our schools. And I think that even in this kind of historic funding challenges, we're seeing concrete kind of gains, record graduation rates. We're still seeing more students earning college credits and credentials, more students earning more dollars in scholarships for our past, I think, 2 graduating class, gains in literacy, particularly for Black and Latinx boys. And so I think that there is evidence that when we have the funding and when we are centering students who are furthest from opportunity, we will be able to impact the student experience. And as someone who has sat with families, always making sure that we are keeping students and families at the table, because it's critical that they have that seat to shape the education system that they are a part of. I think that I'll end with, at every level, we've seen in the district choices that shape real opportunities for young people. And while resources are not yet enough, I think our commitment to continue pushing the system towards a place where every child has what they need to succeed is the right way to go.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. And I appreciate that local lens, the 2 different seats, equity and the school leadership piece. I think, drawing the through line here from the local CPS context into the state, Kevin, I want to turn now to you, kind of taking this through line and bringing us up to some of the broader national landscape as it relates to federal funds, both the use of and the end of ESSER, and get some national level perspective from you in this space.
Sure thing. Thanks, Heather, and good afternoon, everybody. I think my colleagues on the panel touched on some of these pieces already, so I won't belabor the point. But I do think that the end of ESSER, this kind of one-time infusion during an emergency situation, which I think we sometimes forget too, that this was an extraordinary situation where folks in seat were trying to reopen schools, think about the impacts of health challenges that were novel. Those dollars went into plug things that were very necessary in terms of operating, and those dollars are away. So I think that that's impacting different districts in different ways, depending on the size of their award in that instance. But I think it's also coupled with other macro factors that are happening in the economy. So we have rising costs through this extraordinary inflationary period that we had as well. That's often outpacing revenue, not just from the federal side, but also from your local and state side as well. So when you have rising costs, and then you also have these impacts of things like an enrollment-based formula, which Ralph touched on. If enrollment is going down, but your costs are going up, that delta is going to keep going and rising in a way that's going to continue to outpace your ability to pay down the costs that you have. And I think that each of these things are interacting. So it's not just the end of ESSER, it's not just rising costs, it's not just lowering enrollment, it's not just increased needs for the enrollment that you still have, right? So we know that there are rising needs, different kinds of needs post-pandemic that are also impacting the kind of costs that you're seeing show up in schools. All of these things are kind of interrelated to one another that are kind of impacting not just Chicago, but districts across the country in similar kinds of ways. And I think that, we'll touch on it perhaps a little bit later, but we're in a very quickly changing federal context right now as well. And I think that additional uncertainty of what's going to happen with already awarded or being reconsidered title funds, and the passage of the president's domestic policy bill in this last month, those kinds of things are going to have out effects that I think also make it harder to plan for the kind of long-term budget impacts that CPS will face.
Thank you for that, Kevin. I think, and all the panelists thus far for this really rich discussion and sharing your expertise and insights. I want to, looking at the time here, take us into a little bit of like a follow-up kind of popcorn lightning round. And Elizabeth, I want to start with you with some of the through lines here. For just a couple of minutes, I know you were in the unique position of being on the board pre-COVID and then for several years following the pandemic and the return to school. And so I'm curious for you, what stands out to you in this time, particularly as it relates to investment decisions, student experience, progress that was made in spite of the various challenges that the district was facing?
Thanks for that question, Heather. I think one thing to say is the structural deficits that we're experiencing now existed before COVID, right? Because this is the result of things that were happening over a long period of time. And I appreciate Kevin reminding us of the crisis and emergency that was COVID. I just want to recall that so much of the COVID funds that came into districts were used for things like health and safety protocols, in addition to supports for students who were living through the trauma of the pandemic. And just to recall the trauma of the pandemic, their family members dying, right? And so in that context, when you're thinking about these even if they are one-time funds and what to do with them, providing another counselor in a school is an investment worth making to help students navigate through the period of the trauma of the pandemic. So I appreciate Dr. Cook lifting up some of the academic gains that students experience, but I also want to just go back to this moment of trying to triage an emergency and triage a crisis that those funds directly went to. I mean, I think, as was mentioned, just because the depths of the pandemic is over doesn't mean that students still don't need those supports, but the ESSER money is gone. And we do see that students' needs are getting greater and greater, and the pie is not getting greater and greater in a way that's commensurate to meet those needs. So just the scale of CPS, and Ralph pointed to the uniqueness of our district in certain ways, but CPS, because of our scale, serves more students with disabilities, Black students, English learners, and low-income students than almost all of the rest of the state combined. But the way that our funding is structured does not necessarily account for that scale. I also just want to say something about being on a board member at that time. You know, I studied the history of CPS as my profession, and I still did not fully understand the budget when I became a board member. The learning curve was high. But by doing things like attending these community budget meetings, which I really appreciate are being kicked back up again, and digging into this shift that I think was necessary and the communities asked for a very long time, from student-based budgeting to an equity-based budgeting model, was important in trying to address the things that were addressable within the context of the district. So, you know, we're talking about debt in lots of different ways today, and I want to insert one other discussion about debt, and it's by the eminent education scholar Gloria Ladson Billings. And she reminds us that often we focus on things like the achievement gap, but in fact that's misplaced, and that instead we need to look at an educational debt, and that debt has in fact accumulated over time, particularly for those most marginalized within our society, that it is a debt of the historical, economic, socio-political, and moral decisions that have characterized our society and brought us to this point. So, you know, we talk about, and Kevin just mentioned this, our already extremely weak social safety net is being further gutted by cuts to Medicaid, by cuts to the federal education, and all of these other parts of our society. If we're not going to rebuild that safety net at the federal level, and we want schools to serve as community hubs, then we have to find other ways to fund them as such. And I do think there is opportunity in that this is not just a CPS issue. Other districts across the state are hurting and will continue to be hurting too, as federal funding is cut. And as the state continues to put, you know, EBF forward as a not fully funded mandate and continue to underfund EBF, we have to come together to demand that our city and our state pay this educational debt that is owed to our students as a result of these inequities that have structured public education for generations. I'll stop.
Elizabeth, thank you for that. And I think that ties in then to thinking about the highlights here and the complexity of the question. Also bringing back to potentially like some of the ways to continue the progress in light of the challenges. And so, Ralph, I want to circle back to you briefly. You know, certainly in the space of academic progress, student experience, in spite of the financial challenges, and looking out at the 5-year forecast, you know, there's been a little bit of questions in the Q&A here, speaking to the out years. And so want to kind of tie this to you along with the Q&A that is coming in from some of our attendees. But when you think about this and we're hearing this progress piece, what are your thoughts on how the district could potentially sustain some of the progress that has been made in equity and academics and student experience in light of these continued financial challenges?
Yeah, I think Dr. Cook really had some really good points to make when she talked about the utilization. Look, utilization of one-time money to cover operating costs is, just from a fiscal standpoint, it's always a bad idea, because you're going to create your own fiscal cliff, and you know it's coming, you know you're going to run out of money that you funded for. But what they invested in, even in the operational stuff, is stuff that made a difference in kids' student achievement. And if CPS had adequate resources to make those kinds of investments going forward, it would be a real positive thing. I think one thing the district could do, and I was a school board member, president of a school board, vice president of another, and we did this, is lean a little heavier into the matrix created by the evidence-based model. The evidence-based model really sets forth those things that have been demonstrated to drive student achievement for low-income kids, for traditionally disadvantaged kids, even special needs kids. And so what we did at the other school districts was we modeled out our expenditures against the EBF. And we said, well, in some places, what we see is we're spending more than what the evidence indicates we need to spend. And in some cases, we're spending significantly less. Now, when we were spending more, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. We just wanted to have a rational reason for spending more than what the evidence indicated. If we didn't have a rational reason, then there was a pot of money that was available for resource reallocation to some of the areas that do a great job of driving student achievement. And two things that usually get way underfunded at the school level are tier 2 interventionists and supports in the classroom for teachers. And these things have a dramatic impact on student achievement. And so just understanding how you're out of whack with your current resource allocation, because a lot of this happens over time and it's incremental. It's a great way to reset going forward. It's not an I gotcha moment or anything like that. It's just an opportunity to have a resource allocation discussion going forward to tie into the evidence and do better. And the other thing I'll say about the evidence formula is, unlike other school funding formulas, it is both dynamic and synergistic. So it supports for low income kids aren't all just in the low income category. They're for general students, et cetera, in other areas. Supports for EL kids aren't just in the EL thing. So really, if you lean into that as your basis, you have a synergistic approach that's more cost effective that could help you generate better student outcomes going forward. I think CPS deserves a medal for how well they've done, especially coming out of the pandemic, in allocating resources. But now you're talking about, we're not going to have as much resources. What tools do we have in the kit to do the best job with resource allocation? So I think leaning more heavily into the EBF and then taking some really groundbreaking work like the index that Dr. Cook talked about, and saying, all right, here's what the evidence says we should be doing. Here's what our index says additional needs are. So let's do some resource allocation, taking both these things into account to really hit the students that need it most with the evidence-based practices that are most likely to help them attain academically. And when you're in a tight revenue situation, fiscal situation, that's always just a very good approach to long-term resource allocation.
Thank you for that, Ralph. And with that, I do want to give back to Dr. Cook, understanding here what Elizabeth and Ralph have both raised up, and you being our expert in this equity and school leadership space, the resource availability and leaning into this opportunity index and allowing for some contextualization at both the district and the local level. Can you talk a little bit about the transformative process that has had in how you guys have targeted your resources?
Yeah, I think that I think we're in year 2 or maybe year 3 now of the opportunity index being an integral part of how we actually fund schools. And like all tools, it is not a perfect tool, but it is what we have today to determine need in our system and determine where we should prioritize those particular resources. And so things that we have seen, whether it is, I think Dr. Todd Breland talked about, like counselors, like where do we start, right? We have this pot of resources. How do we ensure that they're getting to the students who need them the most? And so whether that is directly through our school funding formula, or whether that is when offices or departments see influx of resources, whether those are through grants or other forms of resources that they may have for allocations to school, also applying that equity lens and using the index in those ways to distribute those resources. And I think that school leaders are now seeing the impact of what that does for their schools, but they're also now realizing, again, they had those resources. They saw the great things that they were able to provide in their schools and school communities. And now we're saying the pot is smaller. We're still distributing those resources more equitably, but you will feel a sense of loss in terms of the amount of resources that the system will be able to provide. And we have to think about, how do we still do that and still try to make the gains that we have seen over the past couple of years?
Thank you for that, Dr. Cook. And I want to acknowledge the questions coming in the Q&A. Thank you for those. I have tried to work in some of the things thematically into some of the questions here. And anything that is explicitly written out there that is not answered here today, we will take those back and, provide responses in those spaces to folks as well. I want to take the last couple of minutes here to kind of do one last question to each of our panelists. And again, thematically, some of what's coming up for our attendees in the Q&A are things around, preserving programs and services that are most dear in spite of things. Special education has come up, and additional questions around just the revenue side of this as well. And so understanding each of your unique expertise here in this space, I think, one of the pieces that I wanted to end with and give you each 1 minute here is to talk a little bit about like, what is one thing that you hope those attending today most walk away with? What's one thing that you would like folks to understand coming away from this particular discussion today? So Kevin, I'll start with you.
Sure thing. I think the importance when you think of the national picture and the federal picture, I think just monitoring that because it does change frequently every day. And I just want to raise up to what Dr. Cook said, like keeping parents and families at the table, I think is a really important component and is something that I appreciate this space for doing that, but I also think it takes, engagement of all to make sure that you're getting to the solutions and the scenarios that you need to find.
Thanks, Kevin. We'll go next to Elizabeth.
Thank you. I think I just want to say, Dr. Cook said this earlier as well. I mean, I'm a former board member. I'm not a board member anymore. But I am a researcher and I study CPS, but I'm also a CPS parent. I'm a former LSC member. We are all deeply invested in our communities and the success of our public schools. And I think I just want to be clear, there is no solution long-term to these problems without new revenue. It is required and our students deserve it. We have never in this country, the United States of America, fully funded and adequately resourced schools serving Black, Brown, and low-income students. That has never happened. That doesn't mean that we can't demand it and that we don't have to all work together to get there. And it will take everyone. And to Dr. Cook's point, that includes shared sacrifice in the moment that we're living in right now. And that requires those with more to give more, because those who need it the most need to stay at top of mind for all of us in this moment.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Ralph, 1 minute to you with the same question. What's one thing you hope those listening here today will take away from this conversation?
Well, the resource issue is going to be especially big for CPS. Statewide, the federal government funds 10% of the cost of K-12 education in Illinois. Last year, they funded 15% of the cost in CPS. Federal cuts are going to disproportionately harm CPS over the rest of the state. So the only way to really make up for this long term is really for the state to do a better job of funding education. And the only way for that is truly for revenue to be on the table there. The state has its own structural imbalance between revenue growth and service cost growth. We need an income tax increase at the state level, and we need to expand our sales tax base to services. And people need to support that, because unless the state gets more revenue, it will not have the fiscal capacity to do the better job of funding education. I will tell you this, there are a number of state legislators, and I'm going to call out the Black Caucus here, particularly in the Black Caucus, who have done a phenomenal job of arguing for the state to live up to its promise to fund education, but the state doesn't have the money. Let's advocate for the state to raise adequate revenue to fund education to the level the evidence indicates it's needed for all our children to walk into a school that has the resources it requires to meet their needs. Period. End of story. That's what we should do.
Thank you for giving voice to that. There's quite a few of the questions and comments in the Q&A are echoing that same sentiment around some of those pieces. So thank you for that. Dr. Cook, I'm going to give you the last word, what you would like people to walk away with remembering today, and then we'll turn it back to Mike to close us out.
Absolutely. So as we look to balance our budget, just keeping equity at the front. So thinking about individual students behind every dollar spent, measuring what is most impactful, and finding out a way to determine what we will measure so that we can show evidence of practices that really impact student experience. And I think that finally, I'll say that making sure that our investments continue to close opportunity and access gaps that support all aspects of the student daily experience.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. Panelists, thank you all very much. I'm going to hand it over to Mike here to just close us out. Really appreciate your time and you sharing your expertise. And to our attendees as well, thank you very much for your active participation today. Mike?
Thank you, Heather. Just to echo some of the gratitude there. Thank you to our panelists here. Thank you to our superintendent, Dr. Macklin King, for bringing us together in this space and committing to a transparent and community-based solution around our budget. And most of all, thank you to the folks that tuned in today. I hope this was meaningful and insightful. Want to encourage you to continue to come out to our community feedback sessions if you would like to be part of this process. We have one tonight at Westinghouse High School at 5:30. On Thursday, we'll be at Roosevelt High School at the same time. And then on Saturday, we'll be at Back of the Yards, followed by our virtual session on Monday. So really encourage you to come out. We had a great meeting last night, got a lot of great feedback that's going to help us going forward. So thank you again, and you'll be hearing from us a lot in the coming days, and we appreciate everyone's engagement and support.
Thank you all. With that, appreciate the time. Take care.